Thank you very much, Maria, for this introduction, and thank you also to all the organizers, Paco and everybody else in the team for having me here with you. And I hope I was able to be with you in person and for all of us to be in person, but I guess the world had very, very different plans for everyone. So I just want to share my thanks for inviting me, and I also want to share that I hope everybody and everybody's family is doing well in these challenging times for the world. And I'm going to share some thoughts with you from a forthcoming article that I have at Harvard Business Review that is going to be the main article in the September-October edition. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek about how we're bringing everything together, where we think the role of the corporation society is going to be in the 21st century, and how the most actually successful and innovative companies are going to be able to drive performance and value creation in the future. Before I do that, I just want to share in a few seconds why I think this discussion is extremely important. And one of the things that we have realized over time is that, in the 21st century, we created an enormous amount of wealth. But what we have painfully realized is that, one, that wealth has come at the expense of the natural environment and the earth that we're living in, and actually we're consuming natural resources in unsustainable ways, and we need to urgently do something about that, because the climate crisis is something that we need to urgently deal with. And the second one is that wealth hasn't created actually shared and inclusive prosperity. And an enormous amount of people actually, especially in the developed world, has fallen behind. So we need to find ways to tackle the increasing inequality that we have been experiencing, because that increasing inequality is leading to populism, both on the left-wing side and on the right-wing side. And we know that that is never a good recipe for actually increasing prosperity in the world. So we need to tackle the increasing problems of climate change and inequality at the same time. And to do that, we need to actually reimagine the role of the corporation society, what good performance means, and how value is being created. So I'm going to share with you a few thoughts about what we have found in the last 15 years of doing, as Maria said, empirical research. I believe in data and I don't believe in opinions as much. And as a result, you will excuse me, but I will try and communicate in just a few minutes 15 years of empirical research that we have undertaken. So let me share my presentation with you. I hope all of you can see what I have here. I call this presentation and the article that is going to be coming in Harvard Business Review, Social Impact Efforts that Create Real Value. And the reason I call this real value is because, yes, in the last 10, 20 years, we have experienced an enormous growth in the number of companies that are touting their social impact efforts and their ESG efforts, environmental, social, and governance efforts. But what I say is that for most companies, that has been a lot about box checking and window dressing. And fundamentally, those social impact efforts haven't been connected to the most fundamental driver of the business, which is strategy. And this is something that a connection that needs to be made in order for real results that are going to be sustainable results and also profitable results to be rewarded by capital markets and by customers and by employees as well. And so what I'm going to present to you is some small bites of research analyzing more than 10,000 companies, conducting about 30 field studies and publishing more than 15 empirical papers in the past 2 decades. And what our collective research points to is really the need for a new management paradigm, one that impact is not at the periphery of the organization. You don't create organizational value and then you're thinking about how you're distributing that, but actually you're integrating impact in the way that value is being created. And really the playbook that we have is on those 4 steps. One is understanding materiality. the materiality of all the different environmental, social, and governance issues that an organization is facing, and really concentrating your efforts on the most material ones, but also understanding the critical difference between operational efficiency and strategy, and understanding that strategy is about being different in the competitive landscape, about differentiating yourself and actually driving performance forward. And I want to show you some results around that. The second one is building accountability structures so that impact is integrated in strategy. And those accountability structures are, of course, starting with a board of directors. And one of the things that we have found is that the most successful organizations have the boards actually integrated and knowledgeable about how impact is being created by the organization. And a fatal flaw is when the boards are actually not connected to that impact journey. But of course, the top-down is not the only approach. It's not sufficient to create integration of impact within strategy. You need to actually have a bottom-up approach. And this is where the role of corporate purpose is so critical. You need to get buy-in from across the organizations, and I would show you some evidence that in most organizations that buy-in doesn't exist, and this is why many of those efforts actually fail. And the fourth one is that you need to be making some operational changes to ensure that the strategy is successfully implemented. So it's not only about strategy development, but critically, it's about strategy execution. And of course, none of that can happen without the right metrics. And this is the role that impact-weighted accounts play and the robust measurement of impact. If you don't have the right KPIs, you are taking the wrong actions and you're driving performance towards the wrong purposes. So you need to have robust metrics, and this is the work that we're doing at the impact-weighted accounts that Ronnie and we have partnered to drive and revolutionize moving forward. We have made enormous progress in the last 12 months, and we're looking forward in the next 12 months to really take that work to the next level and see more and more organizations that are piloting and are practicing those measurements, and they're finding real value and better decision making because of that. So let me start from the first one, which is strategy. And just making that point, the analogy that I make is that for most organizations, they have been looking about those ESG efforts like a cell phone case, not as the operating model that drives the cell phone, but actually what you put around the cell phone, something that you put around the organization to protect your brand and your reputation, but is not really integrated. This is not the chip that is actually driving how the organization is functioning. And this needs to change. Corporate leaders need to embrace a very, very new mentality where both an ambitious and differentiating strategy is needed to see real financial results. And I want to show you here a very now infamous piece of research that we did about 7 to 8 years ago, where we were able to show that actually in order to drive performance, you need to concentrate on the material ESG issues that an organization is facing. And the materiality, of course, is dependent, very much dependent on the industry that you're working. I started observing, for example, many banks that were making a big deal out of their scope 1 emissions. And I always said, this is an immaterial issue, actually. What is material is what are the carbon emissions within your loan portfolio, for example, your risk management practices, the way that you attract and retain human capital, and so forth. But the scope 1 emissions are very critical for an electric utility company, for example, and for mining companies and so forth. So industry by industry, and this is the work that we did at the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board when I was sitting there on the inaugural Standards Council back in 2012, 2013, the organization created industry by industry, which are the most material ESG issues. And when we actually looked at the research and were able to compare companies, competitors, Coca-Cola versus PepsiCo, Bank of America versus JP Morgan, and so forth, and we're able to compare their performance on the material ESG issues versus the immaterial ESG issues. And I'm showing you here the best performers here with a red line, what I call here the top quintile of the distribution versus the worst performance of those dimensions. You see on the left-hand side that actually vastly outperformed their competitors over time. But actually, when these companies were competing on the immaterial ESG issues, what you were finding is that actually there was a slight underperformance of the companies that were concentrating on the immaterial ESG issues. And that has shaped really our understanding about how you can actually understand from a strategy perspective and connect to your strategy what is material and how you can drive performance moving forward. And for that, you really need to understand the competitive levers that you are following in each industry. The second point that I want to make about a strategy is about differentiation. So many people confuse strategy from operational effectiveness. Doing what everybody else is doing when you're thinking about the impact that our organization is having is not strategy. Is that actually you're increasing your operational effectiveness. And I just want to show you here with real data what has happened in the most recent years. So what has happened is that in the past, moving from poor performance to strong performance, and this is a simplified version of what we find in the data, you found that there was a pretty wide distribution of performance of organizations within any given industry. But now, what you're observing is that that performance has gotten much tighter. That distribution has gotten much tighter. Why? Because so many organizations now imitate what other organizations are doing. So, for example, thinking about the supply chain work that apparel companies might be doing, or actually the human capital work that technology companies might be doing, and you find more and more imitation. Everybody will be thinking about the same diversity issues. Everybody will be thinking about the same labor issues in the supply chain, about the same climate issues and so forth. But actually what we have found in the data is that this is not what drives performance. When we look at the data, we find that the companies that are actually able to improve their performance on those material ESG issues and differentiate themselves in the ones that actually other competitors are not able to imitate them, they're the ones that are able to drive performance forward and outperform their peers. And here I'm showing you the operating performance premium for the leaders for differentiation, or what we call common practices. Differentiation are the practices that haven't converged within each industry, while the common practices is where you find a lot of imitation. I'm showing you here the performance premium for leaders in terms of return on capital, return on sales, or asset turnover. And you can see pretty meaningful, actually, improvements in return on capital, return on sale, and asset turnover based on that differentiation. So strategy is about both understanding materiality, but also understanding how you can differentiate yourself. And the second piece in the playbook that I want to share with you is around those accountability structures. Governance is a critical perspective. Why? Because an impact strategy, as I said, it's not about the periphery of the organization. It really involves large operational and strategic changes. And as a result, you must start at the top and then be diffused throughout the entire organization. But what we have found repeatedly in our research is that although many organizations are trying to integrate social impact in their strategy, actually a fatal flaw is that this doesn't have the proper leadership commitment, and also leadership commitment from the board of directors. And as a result, those efforts fail and fail miserably. And as a result, there's a lot of disappointment. What we have found in research that is needed is that the board needs to really understand what are the metrics that properly need to be considered as part of executive compensation, and as a result, what are the metrics that need to be measured and also disclosed as part of the audit committee work in order to inform the strategy of the organization. And of course, as I said, governance is not going to be sufficient. You need to start from a leadership commitment, but then diffuse that throughout the organization. And as a result, you need a culture that rallies around impact. And the other reason that we have found that many of those efforts fail is because, simply enough, people further down in the organization, frontline employees, middle management, they just don't believe in the authenticity of those efforts. They say, of course, these are big words that are coming from our senior executives, but then when you talk to people that are really interacting with the customers, that are really executing on the strategy of the organization, they don't believe. And they also don't believe because they don't have clear direction for how to achieve them, how to integrate them in their workings. And as a result, skepticism leads to those efforts being sidelined or not be consistently implemented across functions, divisions, and business lines. And what this becomes really critical to discuss is about the role of the corporate purpose and building actually a culture around that. And I want to show you some empirical evidence of what we have found about this. And by the way, this purpose idea, although it's much discussed, it's actually not a new idea. One of the most important economists in the history of the world, John Maynard Keynes, actually clearly articulated that, saying that if human nature felt no satisfaction apart from profit in constructing a factory, a railway, a mine, or a farm, there wouldn't be much investment merely as a result of that cold calculation. He really called out that sense of meaning that we get from creating value and that sense of meaning and purpose that we get from the work that we're doing. So over the time, we have actually gotten data from about 2 million employees across more than 1,000 organizations. And we have an operationalized purpose, not by the big statements that an organization is putting on their website, but actually how employees feel inside the organization, whether they feel that their work has meaning and impact, and also about whether there is clarity about that purpose, clarity from the management about that purpose. There's a critical role for management to clearly actually show the direction to people about the purpose of the organization. And this is something that we have also found that is missing from any organization. One of the critical things that we have found, and that's what you see on the left-hand side, is that as you go inside an organization, in general, that sense of purpose within the workforce declines as you go down in the hierarchy. So you find a strong sense of purpose when you ask senior management, a lower one when you go to middle management, and even further drops down when you go to staff and professional and frontline workers. This is a problem. We have found that when that is the case in an organization, all of those efforts to integrate impact within the strategy fail. And actually, on the right-hand side, we have found that organizations that are able to flatten that line of purpose, so actually they're able to diffuse that sense of purpose to middle management and to lower level employees, they're the ones that end up outperforming in the future. And this is why you see that the middle management line there is very positively associated with future return on assets. We have found that it's critical to be able to diffuse that sense of purpose inside the organization. And of course, how do you do that? What is happening in the organization they're able to do that? This is where the operating model comes in. And this is what I wanted to touch on as well very briefly. One of the things we have found over the time is that actually most organizations, they start their impact journey from a compliance perspective, trying to make sure that nothing goes wrong. In studying firms that have successfully implemented an impact strategy, they pass through 3 phases. They start from compliance, protecting your brand, your reputation, and ensure compliance with regulations and other laws in order to reduce risk. And then they move towards efforts to improve operating efficiency, cutting energy, cutting water, improving those dimensions, because actually that makes business sense, that improves their efficiency. And then they move to efforts to innovate and grow. And this is where a lot of the value has been created. This is where markets and products are being reimagined and actually where impact can be maximized at that third stage. But what we have found is, how do you get there? What organizations do to successfully get at that third stage? And we have found that the critical piece to understand is this centralization curve. What you see on the y-axis is the degree to which decision-making inside an organization is centralized around those impact activities. And what you see on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, is the stage that you're in, the stages that I showed you before: compliance, efficiency, and growth and innovation. And here's the trick. The organizations that are able to achieve this evolution, going from compliance to efficiency and to growth and innovation, exemplary firms, successful firms, typically start by centralizing the activities, which is helpful to moving from a focus on risk and compliance to a focus on operating efficiency. So establishing a function, centralizing those decision rights, and driving those operating efficiencies in the organization. But critically, what we also found was that to reach the innovation and growth stage, companies need to decentralize activities and empower corporate functions to take responsibility for them. This is why, for example, you might find that organizations such as Unilever or Natura, they won't even have a centralized function for many of those efforts, but they actually are able to diffuse those decision rights in the corporate functions, in finance, in marketing, in procurement, and so forth. Because that's the way that you can actually achieve that sense of purpose as well, by empowering people in the to take into account new information and local information and implement those decision rights. And this is a critical aspect of the operating model and the decentralization of the decision rights. The last thing that I want to mention before I wrap is why actually impact-weighted accounts is the glue that brings everything together. At the impact-weighted accounts that we started last year, we have a theory of change, which is that we need better measurements in order to make better decisions. And better decisions create better markets, better allocations, and better societal outcomes. So we are showcasing why we need the impact-weighted accounts. We published our first report, which was the theory of change, and the second one about a series of papers showcasing the how impact-weighted accounts can be done. And I will show a few examples of that. And the third one, to showcase to the market that impact-weighted accounts are happening in collaboration with the Impact Management Project, and of course with the global steering group that Ronnie is leading. What do we mean by that? I want to show you two examples. We're working on three main areas: environmental impact, product impact, and employment impact. The environmental impact is more developed area, so I want to concentrate here and show you two examples, one from product impact and another one from employment impact, for two real companies that we have been able to measure. First, we define what we mean by that. We look at product impact in terms of reach that an organization is having, larger reach, larger impact, of course, in terms of quantity and duration. For a company like Ford, that might be vehicles sold, and of course the maximum mileage that the car might have. And then we're looking at the product impact from the perspective of the customer. And in terms of dimensions of customer usage, we're looking at access, quality of the product, and what we call optionality, whether the customer is actually consuming the product, having full access to information and free will, which, for example, for a company like a tobacco company, that might not be the case. So we're looking at those dimensions, and of course, we're also looking from the product impact perspective, environmental use and end of life, pollutants and efficiency and recyclability. So for example, in the case of a car, as you could imagine, we might be looking for issues of access, such as, for example, vehicle, fuel, and maintenance cost, and whether actually the product is being provided to underserved markets. In terms of quality, we might be looking at issues of recalls, safety rating, customer satisfaction, so forth. For environmental use, we might be looking at emissions from the usage, tailpipe line emissions, and recyclability and recoverability of vehicles. And what you see actually at the bottom line is real numbers. These are real numbers that we have calculated for in the case of Ford. Ford, for example, in terms of access, has been underperforming its competitors. As a result, we have been able, using a science-based approach that takes each one of those dimensions and finds from a socioeconomic perspective what are the dollar costs and dollar benefits. We found that it's a little bit more than 1 billion in negative terms for product impact when it comes to access. But for quality, it has outperformed much of the other competitors. As a result, it has had a 4.8 positive billion recording. And of course, for environmental use, because of the pollution, a very negative impact, 8.7 billion. But end of life, pretty good recyclability, giving a 1.3 billion in positive numbers. And you can think about those calculations now informing an impact weighted revenue number. So not only how much you're selling, but actually how much impact you are creating through your sales. And as you can see here, those numbers can be very, very useful from a management perspective, for a decision-making perspective, but also for investors out there, as they're actually trying to align allocations of capital with impact. And one of the things that you can see is that you can find actually how you can decarbonize your product portfolio, and you will see that environmental use becoming more and more beneficial and less negative over time. You can see how you can compete on the recircular economy, and that end-of-life use product number will becoming more and more positive. How you can actually outperform your competitors by improving the quality of your products, and again, that number will be improving, and so forth. So this is just one example from the product side. And of course, another one that I want to show you is on the employment side. So on the employment side, and these are real numbers that we have calculated for another company, in this case, Intel, a chip manufacturer. And although many people have been discussing about actually good jobs and employment impact and so forth, there is no actually clear way of calculating what is actually the impact that an organization is having on its employees. So here we have actually defined it in 3 ways. What is the impact that's provided to the employees? Who is it provided to? And how is it provided? And that's what you see on the top line. So within what is provided to employees, we're looking at wage quality, at benefits, at career advancement. All 3 are very, very important dimensions of what an employee is getting. Of course, an employee is getting quality of wages, and we're adjusting that for level, utility, and equity. And of course, an employee is also getting benefits. And of course, an employee is getting also advancement, opportunities for career advancement in the terms of promoting. Of course, who is getting it is very, very critical. I think the recent cases of racial discrimination that we have seen in the US, but I think this is a global phenomenon, suggests that we have a long way to go in terms of diversity and inclusiveness. And this is another dimension that we're looking. But also not only looking at the levels of diversity, but also at the progression of diversity within the organization. And as a result, the opportunities that are being created. Of course, location. Creating a job at an area of high unemployment is more impactful than creating a job at an area of low unemployment. So location matters as well. So many actually areas have fallen behind in our capitalist system. And how is employment provided? Health and safety issues, subjective well-being. And when we start from that, and this is what some organizations have been doing, they're looking at the total salaries that are being paid. In this case, in the context of Intel, this has been 7.3 billion in 2018. And then they add that as value created. But of course, that is a very simple calculation that doesn't take into account all of those dimensions that I talked about. So we're actually calculating those numbers and what it looks like. And you can see actually, for example, in the case of Intel, that for wage quality, we're calculating close to a 5 billion positive impact from that employment impact in terms of wage quality. But actually, for example, when you look at diversity, because the organization is not as diverse as it could be, relative to best-in-class competitors, that is a minus almost 2 billion impact, negative impact. And so you can see there that actually, when you're looking at that, it gives you a much better perspective about how an organization is creating impact and where are the opportunities actually for improvement when you're looking at that. So there are many more detailed calculations, but our perspective is that if you actually cannot have great numbers to be making good decisions and disciplined decision-making process and enable people to make better decisions, both inside organizations and inside markets, we're not going to be able to actually create an impact economy and create the next wave of innovation that is going to propel to a better society for everyone. I just want to thank you for the attention and thank you for having me. And after Ronnie's presentation, I'll be happy to answer any questions about the research and all the work that we have been doing. Thank you very much.